This happened back in the fall of 2023. I was driving through Wyoming in my beat-up old Honda. Relocating to a new city is always a massive headache, but I wanted to save some cash on a plane ticket, and since I had to move all my heavy boxes and personal belongings anyway, I decided to road trip it down the old federal highways. Shipping a car and paying for extra airline baggage would have completely drained my wallet, and I was already on a tight budget. My GPS completely crapped out around 7 in the evening when the cell service dropped to 0, and the sky over the prairie turned into a wall of heavy bruised storm clouds. Around me, there was nothing but a vast, pitch-black void and cracked asphalt. At a gas station I'd passed a couple of hours earlier, a local guy lazily spat between his teeth and said, "Stick to the main road, son, and don't take the old bypass." But in the dark, under a blinding downpour, I missed the turnoff. By midnight, my gas tank was running on fumes, and the rain was hitting the windshield so hard the wipers couldn't keep up with the sheets of water. I was already mentally preparing myself to spend the night in a dead car in the middle of nowhere, when suddenly, through the thick wall of rain, a faint light flickered ahead. It was an old neon sign. The red, dying letters buzzed lazily in the dark. Motel. Right below it, a dim yellow sign barely gasped out. Vacancy. The motel looked like a textbook nightmare straight out of an American horror movie. A long, single-story L-shaped building, peeling paint on the room doors, and a parking lot with absolutely no cars except for an old, rusted pickup truck parked near the front office. I didn't give a damn about how it looked. I just needed a dry mattress, some heat, and a roof over my head. I parked, threw the hood of my jacket over my head, and bolted toward the glass door of the office. Above the door, a rusted bell let out a dull, hollow clang. Inside, it smelled like old carpets, dampness, and cheap pine-scented cleaner. There was nobody behind the front desk. On the wall behind the clerk's counter hung an old wooden board with metal hooks for keys. There were 14 rooms in total, numbered 1 through 12. And then it skipped straight to 14 and 15. Room 13, as is often the case in America due to old superstitions, simply didn't exist on the board. I coughed loudly to get some attention. From a cramped back room behind the desk, a thin, unnaturally pale old man in a greasy flannel shirt slowly stepped out. His movements were weirdly sluggish, like he was moving underwater or suffering from a severe illness. He looked at me with dull, completely unblinking eyes. "Good evening. I need a single room for one night," I said, pulling a credit card out of my wallet. The old man didn't even glance at the card. He slowly leaned down, pulled out a heavy leather-bound ledger from under the counter, and slid a yellowed pen toward me. "Cash only, kid. $20. His voice sounded like the crunch of dry autumn leaves underfoot. "Write your name down right here." I handed him the 20 and quickly scribbled my name in the ledger. The old man turned toward the key rack. His hand hovered over the hooks for a second, and that's when I noticed something strange. All the keys, with their heavy diamond-shaped plastic tags, were hanging in place. The motel was entirely vacant, but the old man didn't reach for them. Instead, he shoved his hand deep underneath the counter and fished out an old brass key covered in a layer of greenish patina. On the plastic tag, scratched and filthy, the number 13 was crookedly written with a black marker. I frowned and looked back at the board on the wall. "Excuse me, but you don't have a room 13 on your board. And, the superstition. Can I just get room 5 or 7? They're vacant." The old man slowly raised his dead eyes to meet mine. His lips stretched into a deeply unsettling, lifeless smile, exposing his rotted yellow teeth. "There are no vacant rooms in this motel except for this one, son. Take 13. And remember the golden rule. If you hear a knock on your door tonight, do not open it, no matter who calls you by your name." I mentally rolled my eyes, brushing it off as the ramblings of a creepy local redneck out in the sticks. I took the key, turned around, and walked back to my car to grab my duffel bag from among the tightly packed moving boxes. I walked along the long outdoor walkway, lighting my path with my phone's flashlight because the fluorescent bulbs under the awning were ominously flickering, buzzing, and dying out. Room 10, 11, 12. The next door should have been 14, but right between rooms 12 and 14, I saw a blank, dark wooden door with no number on it. The paint was cracked with age, and the doorknob was covered in the same green patina as my key. I slid the key into the keyhole. It turned with a heavy metallic scrape. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was furnished in a vintage 80s style. A cheap boxy tube TV on a nightstand, a bed with a faded floral comforter, and an old armchair tucked into the corner. But what struck me most was the layout. There were no windows in the room. None at all. Just blank walls covered in old striped wallpaper. It smelled like the room hadn't been opened in at least 40 years. I locked the deadbolt, dropped my bag on the floor, and collapsed onto the bed. Pure exhaustion hit me like a lead weight. I decided not to even undress. I just kicked off my shoes. The TV didn't work, and my phone, of course, showed no service. I closed my eyes and instantly fell into a deep sleep. I woke up to a sudden, bone-chilling cold. The room was pitch black, so dark I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. My breath was coming out in thick plumes of white vapor. I reached for my phone and tapped the screen. The time was 3:14 a.m. The battery icon showed a mere 1%, and at that exact second, a terrifying sound shattered the silence. Thud, thud, thud. Someone struck my door 3 distinct times with something heavy. It wasn't a fist. The sound was hollow, like it was made by wood or bone hitting the door. Everything inside me tightened with fear. I instantly remembered the old man's words. "Do not open it." I froze on the bed, holding my breath, terrified to make even the slightest sound. A minute passed. Then, a strange rustling sound came from outside the door, followed by a low, muffled voice. That sound made my hair stand on end. It was my girlfriend's voice, but she was back in New York, 2,000 miles away from this place. "Mark, let me in. It's raining so hard out here. I'm freezing. Mark, please open the door." The voice sounded completely real, with her exact cadence, her habit of slightly drawing out her vowels, but my mind screamed, "That's impossible." I sat on the bed, squeezing my eyes shut, whispering to myself, "It's just a hallucination. I'm exhausted from driving." The voice outside the door suddenly shifted. It grew deeper, thinner, and now it was my late grandfather's voice. "Mark, why aren't you opening up? We're all waiting for you out here. Open this damn door." The noises outside began to multiply frantically. Someone was scratching the wood with their fingernails, rattling the doorknob. The deadbolt on the door groaned, the metal bending under extreme pressure. It felt like a whole crowd of people was trying to break in, and they were all screaming, crying, and calling my name in the voices of the people I loved most. I couldn't take the psychological pressure anymore. Screaming in terror, I grabbed my phone, switched on the flashlight, and the screen flickered on its last percent and died, and bolted toward the door. not to open it. I wanted to drag the heavy armchair from the corner to barricade it, but when the flashlight beam caught the door in that final second before dying, I stopped dead in my tracks. The doorknob wasn't moving. The deadbolt was perfectly in place, but the noises weren't coming from outside the hallway. They were coming from inside the door itself. The wooden panel was vibrating, and a thick black fluid resembling motor oil was oozing from the micro cracks in the old wood. It was as if the door itself was a living entity that had digested the voices of my loved ones and was trying to spit them back into my face. And then the noises abruptly stopped. A dead, ringing silence fell over the room. My phone was completely dead, and I was left in total, absolute darkness. I stood in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, when suddenly the old box TV clicked on behind my back. Its picture tube flickered with a dim, deathly blue light, casting ominous shadows across the room. There were no channels broadcasting, just white noise, static snow, and a loud hissing roar. I slowly turned around to face the screen. In the center of that gray static, a blurry image began to surface. It was CCTV security footage. The camera was filming this exact room. I could see the bed, the nightstand, my bag on the floor, and myself standing in the middle of the space on the screen. But on the screen, inside the TV, I wasn't alone. Standing directly behind my back was that pale old clerk. His long skeletal fingers with yellow claws were hovered right above my neck, and his face on the screen was slowly inching closer to the back of my head. I spun around violently in real life. There was no one behind me, just a blank wall. I looked back at the TV screen. On it, the old man had already grabbed me from behind. His mouth opened unnaturally wide, and my reflection on the screen was screaming silently as his black eyes began to fill with that same dark fluid. I realized that if I stayed in that room for one more minute, I would never make it out. Logic, reality, everything went out the window. I lunged at the door, grabbed the handle, ripped open the deadbolt, and threw the door open with all my might, expecting to tumble out into the midnight rain of the motel. I fell forward on my face, but I didn't hit the asphalt under the rain. I landed on cold, wet grass. Around me, a bright morning sun was shining. Birds were chirping. I looked around, frantically rubbing my eyes. I was lying in the middle of a vast, overgrown field of weeds, about 50 yards away from an old, cracked shoulder of a highway. There was no motel in sight, no buildings, no neon signs, just the endless, empty prairie of Wyoming. My Honda was sitting on the shoulder of the road. The driver's side door was swung wide open. I scrambled to my feet, hyperventilating, and ran to the car. My phone was sitting safely on the passenger seat. I turned it on. The battery was at 84%. The time was 8:30 a.m. The GPS was working perfectly, displaying my route. It was just a nightmare. I fell asleep at the wheel from exhaustion and pulled over, I said out loud, trying to calm my shaking hands. The thought brought back a shred of my sanity. Realism won. The whole thing had been just a dream. I climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key in the ignition, and the engine purred obediently to life. I reached into my jacket pocket to grab my cigarettes, and my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. I slowly pulled my hand out of my pocket. Resting in my palm was an old brass key covered in green patina. Tied to it by a filthy string was a scratched plastic tag with the number 13 crookedly written in black marker. And on the back of that tag, written in fresh, wet ink, was a note. See you soon, Mark. The air in the car cabin instantly vanished. The temperature dropped in a second, and a thick plume of white vapor rolled out of my mouth once again. I began to shake so violently that my teeth chattered against each other. Trembling, I forced my eyes up and looked into the rearview mirror, and my entire world shattered. Behind the car, standing in the dead center of that empty, sun-drenched field, was him. The thin, deathly pale old clerk in his greasy flannel shirt. He stood in a state of absolute, unnatural stillness, like a mannequin, staring right at the back of my head through the rear glass. His lips were stretched into that horrifying maniacal smile, exposing his rotted yellow teeth. And that smile was so impossibly wide that the skin on his cheeks was tearing open, and that same black, thick fluid from room 13 was slowly oozing down his chin. But that wasn't the worst part. I blinked, praying that the vision would vanish, but the old man didn't disappear. With every breath I took, he got closer. He wasn't taking steps, his body wasn't moving, but every single time I blinked, the distance between us snapped shut. Blink, and he was 10 feet from my bumper. Blink, and his face was taking up half of the rear windshield. In a blind panic, I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal. The engine roared. The tires spun furiously against the gravel, kicking up dirt, and I launched forward onto the highway. I drove at full speed, flying down the road, too terrified to even glance down at my mirrors for a fraction of a second. I made it out. I reached the city. But the nightmare isn't over. Now, no matter where I drive, I know with absolute certainty. In my jacket pocket sits the key to a room that is waiting for my return. And when night falls, I am utterly terrified to look at any reflective surface, because I know the moment I blink in front of a mirror, his yellow smile will be standing right behind me,